Tim Smith, and today I want to talk about Cookstyle 5.2. Maybe you hadn't seen the releases that were on our chef mailing list, but we've been doing a lot of work with Cookstyle lately and bringing new cops to you, and I want to talk a little bit about what that actually means. So previously, if you wrote chef cookbooks and you wanted to make sure that you were doing the right thing, we had two different tools for you. We had Food Critic, which has been around for years. Food Critic would look over your code, would tell you specific things that you were doing wrong with your usage of chef. It had about 120 different rules in it. And those rules kind of vary from things that are deprecations onto things that will actually cause chef to fail. And in the middle, there's things that maybe aren't such a great idea. It'll offer hints at refactoring your code. We also had a tool called Cookstyle. Cookstyle uses RuboCop. If you're familiar with the Ruby ecosystem, RuboCop is a really amazing code linter, and we wrapped RuboCop with our own set of rules. Those rules were things that we thought were great tips and tricks for using Ruby specific to your cookbooks. But these were really just suggestions for writing Ruby code. It wasn't specific to chef or anything within a cookbook. It was just more about formatting your code and making your code presentable and understandable to colleagues and people you might share it with. What we've done recently, though, with the release of Cookstyle 5.1 and today we released 5.2, is add chef-specific RuboCop cops. Cops are the rules in RuboCop. Added a bunch of chef-specific rules to RuboCop. Today we released 12 new ones. And the great thing about RuboCop is RuboCop comes with auto-correction. Food Critic could not actually auto-correct your code, so it would tell you a whole bunch of things you did wrong, and then it would be up to you to kind of go through and manually fix all that. Well, RuboCop gives us the ability within Cookstyle to just say, hey, auto-correct my code, fix this stuff for me, I don't want to worry about it. And we have 12 new cops today. That brings us up to 45 total cops. I think we're going to release tons more in the coming weeks and months and get to the point where you don't have Food Critic. We have one tool for linting all your code and checking on what you're doing with Chef, and it will be able to auto-correct your code, which is great. We'll be able to auto-correct away deprecations and common mistakes and things like that. So what does it look like? Well, this is just a release announcement. It just talks about some of the rules we've introduced. They're all under this chef namespace, so it's chef dash whatever. RuboCop itself has things under namespaces like linting and style and things like that. So we're going to use the chef namespace for now. That may change. We may break that down a little bit. But let's see what some of these rules look like and why this matters to you, why this is a cool thing to have. So I wrote a cookbook called My Bad Cookbook. Fantastically descriptive name. My Bad Cookbook is kind of a standard chef cookbook, maybe that's been around for a long time. It's got a lot of technical debt. It's got a lot of things that were written that maybe were really great with chef 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 6 years ago, but they're maybe not the best anymore. And we're going to look at this and see what we can do. It's got some resources, it's got a recipe, and it's a default kind of example thing, so maybe not entirely functional. Might have some blank spots here that say there would be code here. But it's a great example of showing you what you can do with Cookstyle, right? So we'll just run this Cookstyle command, and we'll point it at My Bad Cookbook and see what it does. So bam, super fast. That's the first thing to see here. If you've ever used Food Critic before, Food Critic was not that fast. Cookstyle is very, very fast, which is great. But it found a whole bunch of different things. It found them, it's labeling them with R, which is the refactor level. The great thing you're going to see here, 35 offenses were detected. But if you've used Cookstyle before, it would actually fail your builds. This looks like it is still failing my build, which is a whole nother issue. I think that's for another problem though. It won't fail your builds for the new cops. There's one of these, I think, that is actually a real RuboCop warning. That is not one of the chef cops. But the chef cops are at this refactor level. Refactor level will not fail builds, which is great. Yeah, it's actually this one, which is not a chef rule, which ruins my example. Anyways, It found a whole bunch of different problems with the chef code, and it gives you a description of each one that kind of tells you what you're doing and why that matters. And this would be really frustrating, right? If you saw this and you said like, oh man, my metadata has a non-SPDX compliant license string. Like, how do I fix that? Oh, well, I could go to this website and I could go read about all these different license strings, and then I can go fix all my cookbooks. But maybe I have like 200 cookbooks. I don't want to do that for each one. And then it'll tell you about some things you don't need anymore in your metadata and all this stuff. And you're like, this isn't really helpful because this is just a lot of suggestions for my code cleanup. But like I said, we have autocorrection, which is pretty cool. So let's take those 35 offenses we saw there and let's run it with this -a flag in the command. And now we're going to autocorrect. And first of all, we see that not quite all of them autocorrected. Some things can't be automatically fixed. But for a lot of these offenses that we saw, we could totally automatically correct these. So I want to go over now just some of the latest and greatest here. These are only the new things that we introduced in this last release. And I have a backup of this same cookbook so we can see the differences between the two. We can see what it actually autocorrected. The first thing I want to pop open is the metadata. This is one of the places that I've really focused on in Cookstyle in this last release. The file on the right is before it was autocorrected. On the left is what we autocorrected to. You'll see that it shrunk a lot, right? We went from 35 lines down to 14 lines, and we shedded a lot of complexity here. And that's the key. There was a lot of stuff that I was seeing in people's metadata that just wasn't necessary anymore. A lot of baggage that had been brought from olden days and some things that we never actually fully implemented at Chef. So this will clean it up. The first one is the license string. This is an SPDX compliant license string, Apache -2.0. We can parse that out. We can look that up. We can tell you if you are compliant with any corporate licensing standards you have. It's really important that people use the right ones because then we can actually look them up and make sure you're not bringing GPL code or something like that into your environment. This long description, we deleted that. Turns out long description wasn't actually used anywhere. We weren't using that in Chef Client. We were just using that in the community. It had been brought in. People saw it and put it into all their cookbooks. Examples from years ago used it. There's no reason for it, so let's get rid of it. These if respond to blocks, this is another thing that I see a lot of people kind of needlessly adding to their cookbooks. This was necessary in the Chef 12 days, early on in Chef 12. Later Chef 12 releases made this totally redundant. We're actually trying to make sure that we don't accidentally include Chef version on a version of Chef that doesn't know about that metadata. The same with this issue URL and source URL. Newer versions of Chef 12 even know about these, so there's just no point in doing these anymore. This support line, we're saying what platform we support in our cookbook. Well, there is no Chef platform of Darwin. In fact, there's a lot of platforms that we saw commonly on the supermarket that people were entering here that weren't correct. So we took all the common mistakes, things like Darwin, and auto-corrected them to what that actually means. Things like OpenSUSE become OpenSUSE Leap, Darwin becomes macOS X, macOS X Server becomes macOS X, things like that. So that'll help make sure that the data on the supermarket and the data that you're using, if you're parsing out these metadata, is actually correct. Now we have another dependency here. This dependency is on My Bad Cookbook. Well, this cookbook itself is My Bad Cookbook. There's no need to depend on itself. So we can just delete that line. Below it, we see compat resource. This is another Chef 12 thing. We backported a lot of functionality from later versions of Chef 12 onto the very early versions of Chef 12, Chef 12.0 to 12.5. We brought them back. I would certainly hope that everyone is on at least Chef 12.5 at this point. So there's really no reason to load compat resource. That's a huge amount of code that you're bringing down onto all of your servers. Managing that as a dependency just goes away, right? That's great. Here we have a whole bunch more dependencies that go away. These are our cookbooks that provided resources that we built into Chef 14. Chef 14 shipped with a ton of additional resources, things like Build Essential, Chef Handler, Hostname, DMG. Those are built into Chef now. So there's no reason, again, to pull all that code down to your nodes, to manage versions of these cookbooks, to make sure that they're compatible with the latest versions of Chef, because you're not actually running anything in them. They're just extra baggage. So let's get rid of them. And then the last bits here are a bunch of metadata. that actually was never used by Chef. This is really similar to the long description when I said above. These were things that maybe at some point we thought we were going to implement, and by at some point I mean 8 years ago, but we never got around to it. Things like suggests and replace and provides and conflicts, those don't actually do anything. We see people using them often, but really that's something that you should put in your README. You should put it in a place that humans read, because this is machine readable code right here, and machine is not actually doing anything with that code. The last one there is the attributes. You see lots and lots of people who document all of their attributes in the metadata. The problem there is it's almost never kept in sync. And if it's not up to date, if it's not in sync with what's actually in the attributes file, it's really next to useless. It's also not utilized by Chef anywhere. This isn't in the Chef server. It's not on Supermarket. It's not exposed in any of our tooling. So we've decided to just delete that anywhere we see it. And this could go on, This is a cookbook that only had one attribute. But if you had 50 attributes, you could be talking about lots and lots of code that you were maintaining that was doing nothing. So let's get rid of that. All right, let's move on. Let's open up our recipe and see what we did there. The first part we have is this require recipe. Require recipe is a super, super old way of including a recipe in your cookbook. It's actually been replaced with include recipe. They're an alias, but just so we make sure that somebody can read your code and fully understand what you're doing, we're going to autocorrect that to include recipe, because why not? This next one is kind of a tricky one to explain. What people are often trying to do here, this is a template resource, but you could do this with any Chef resource, is they use an only if or a not if. They're trying to gate whether this resource should execute or not. And they're doing it, in this case, with a string that is actually a command. So this would be something like, my cool command, and then I want to grep for true, right? I want to see if my cool command returns true. And if it does, and this executes in the shell, that'll execute with or exit with a 0, and Chef will see that 0 exit code and it will run that template. If it doesn't get a 0 exit code, if it gets a 1 or whatever, then Chef won't run. The problem you run into is often people will wrap it as if it's kind of a hash, I think is the thought. But this has a very different meaning in Ruby. What you're actually doing here is you're saying this is a block of Ruby code I want you to execute. And the problem is if you execute a block of Ruby code that's just a string, what you're basically saying here is this. You're saying true, only if true. Well, true is always true, so this resource would always run. We had a food critic rule for this, but even with that, I saw a lot of people that were using this on the Supermarket. It's a pretty common mistake, I'll be honest. I did this a lot myself, just because when I first came to Chef as a user that wasn't a Ruby native, I didn't entirely understand what that was. I didn't understand that I was accidentally making this Ruby code. So if we see it, if we see just a string inside of a block, we're going to turn that into just a string, and that'll execute as a command now, and it'll work. You might see some failures. That meant that you were always having failures. If you had something like a string that will always be true here, if this was just a string, well, that meant it was always executing and you had some seriously broken code. So that is that one. Let's look at the resources now. I have two different kinds of resources here. I have a traditional kind of a LWRP and then a more modern custom resource that someone had converted. The first one here is kind of a traditional LWRP. It was using, again, if respond to. This is an old if respond to that was just not necessary, right? So let's just clean that up. Let's delete that resource name bit there, and we can just define resource name as we wish. Now onto this LWRP that had been converted to a custom resource. So I know that this is a custom resource because it has properties and actions all in a single file, right? That's kind of the marker of a custom resource. Unfortunately, when a lot of people convert their traditional LWRPs into custom resources, they keep around a lot of the baggage that we removed with custom resources. And this is some of it. So actions is not necessary anymore, and allowed actions is not necessary. Whatever you define down below is an action and an allowed action. So there's no reason to do that. We'll just delete it for you. And there was a lot of confusion in the Chef world. We used the word attribute a few too many times. So in resources now, we call those properties. That reduces a lot of confusion around node attributes versus resource attributes because they're not the same thing at all. So we got rid of that. We'll autocorrect it for you. Anywhere we see attribute, we'll autocorrect that. Anywhere we see name attribute, we'll autocorrect that as well. I do want to go back and look at the things that did not autocorrect. These are things that require a little more attention from someone. So we'll just run this one more time and we'll see. Here's 4 things that couldn't autocorrect. So what were they? Oh, we'll open up those files. The first one is this. This is a really old kind of a Chef 11 dependency, the partial search cookbook. Partial search is a feature we've had in Chef since about Chef 12, 12.0 maybe even. It's built into the search method and it allows you to filter out what you want. So instead of doing a search for a whole bunch of nodes and getting back all the information on those nodes, you would get back just the part you wanted. So maybe you only cared about the IPs, maybe you only cared about the node names, you'd get back just that small little bit of data instead of this massive data set that could be a few megs. We introduced that in a cookbook as partial search. It's a deprecated cookbook. It's been built into Chef since Chef 12. You shouldn't use it, but it does require you to do a little bit of refactoring. So we're not going to just delete this for you. That meant that you were using the partial search method somewhere in your code, and you should clean that up. In the future, you might see a cop that will do that for you automatically. It's definitely something we could do programmatically. But for now, we're just going to flag this resource or this dependency and tell you you should do the cleanup. All right, let's go into the actual recipe. Within this recipe, we had a few different things. Before we talked about the things we auto-corrected, we also have 2 different resources here. These are resources we got rid of in Chef 13. Easy install was kind of a packaging system for applications. You probably haven't heard of it because it's not really used anymore. And we took it out of Chef. It turns out it didn't actually work. And again, no one is really using it anymore. So we got rid of the easy install packaging setup. We also got rid of the Erl call. This is for running Erlang code directly in your recipe. Again, I don't think this is anything anybody ever did. We used this internally at Chef a long time ago within the Chef server cookbooks. They would actually set up the Chef server with Erlang and do all kinds of crazy stuff. But I don't think anybody needed these. You would want to look at these in your cookbooks and kind of determine what you were trying to do with either of these and refactor that stuff. But this code will not run on a modern version of Chef 13 or later. So you would need to clean that up. And then the last one is this. This is a really funky way in a resource of setting a property. This is an LWRP, so we'll kind of talk about it in the context of an attribute. This is, if you've ever heard of a heavyweight resource provider, this is the way a lot of heavyweight resource providers set up their attributes or properties, as they're called now. They set them up by actually creating a method that had the name of the property, and then they would, in the class, they would initialize and run this method. It's a very funky way to do it, totally not necessary. On top of it not being necessary and a lot more work, this doesn't get you things like proper reporting, documentation, and some of the data validation that we provide you with the built-in attribute and properties methods. So I'll convert this real quick to what it would look like. It's severity, and then we'll kind of string. And that's it, right? That is the equivalent of this. And like I said, there'd be a little bit more in the classes setting this all up. But if you had a resource that had 15 properties or 15 attributes, and you set them all up using set or return, that's a massive amount of code. You don't need it. It's very confusing. Looking at this, especially as a new Chef user and trying to figure out what it's doing, is a little weird because you'd have these and then you'd also have them in this initializer where other values would be set, and it's just some crazy stuff. So you could delete that and refactor that away. And then you would run it again, and you would have not as many. You have to save it. It helps to save. You would have 3 errors. 3 errors now. So that's it. That's everything that is in Chef or Cookstyle 5.2. Some cool new autocorrects in there. A few things that you have to fix yourself. But for the most part, those things just autocorrect. I've got about 60 more issues created in that Cookstyle repo that are more things that we're going to autocorrect, more things we're going to learn on, some of the best food critic rules. The eventual goal is just to eliminate food critic, We're going to have, like I said, one tool that does it all, one tool with autocorrection, but we're also looking at all the different things we can do in your code. Now that we can autocorrect it away, we can alert on all kinds of stuff. So we can look at all kinds of things that we see that aren't chef best practices, and we can clean them up, which is going to be a lot of fun. I'm super excited for this, and I hope that you're super excited to clean up your existing code base. So thanks for watching.